Welcome to another session, Searching for Answers. We're working our way through the Epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, asking ourselves as we go, what does it mean to walk by faith? Because we're right in the middle of that famous faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11. So while you grab your Bibles, we'll introduce ourselves and we'll get right into the text. Dr. Bernard Taylor, biblical scholar of both Old and New Testament. He knows his biblical languages backward and forward, and he usually reads them forward in the New Testament and backward in the Old, right? Dr. William Johnson, New Testament scholar, who has spent much of his focus in the New Testament study on the Epistle to the Hebrews. Pastor Beverly Maravilla on the pastoral staff at La Sierra University Church in Family Ministries, and Dr. Leo Ranselin, New Testament scholar and Associate Dean of the School of Religion at La Sierra University, at Loma Linda University. Right. I'm at La Sierra. we could talk about swapping if you would like.
Two great
My
places.
name is John Jones, and let's get into it. Bill, help us get caught up here with where we are.
Okay, we're working our way through this wonderful chapter, chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, the faith chapter. And last time we looked in particular at Moses. That started in verse 22. And the experience of Moses taken as a child and hidden, and his life was saved. And then how he grew up in the court of Pharaoh, came of age, and renounced it all the pleasures, all the riches, threw in his lot with the people of God to join a despised group of slaves. So now we've come to verse 29, and I'm reading now from the New King James Version. By faith, these are the Israelites, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. The verses that will come immediately afterwards, well, it's like a river running and coming to a gorge and running faster and faster and faster. So the pace picks up in a marvelous climax, but we'll get there in just a moment. So we're on the last of these specific examples that he's given, talking about Red Sea experience, Jericho, and John, interesting, Rahab the harlot.
Yeah.
So, question we've discussed in the past here, are these people in this chapter heroic men and women, giants, as it were, or are they ordinary people who believed, who trusted God, and God did wonders with them? And, when you come to a person like Rahab, seems to me you have to say, no, it's the latter. It's the latter.
Yeah. Yes, people, flesh and blood people, and yet somehow faith helps them transcend the constraints and demands and challenges of their daily lives in some way, doesn't it? Yeah. Anybody else want to pick up on verses 29 through 31 before we move on?
This is the reading of the New Revised, and I think you had a pronoun, and this has, by faith the people. I think yours was by faith they?
They, yeah.
Yes.
You have
but the people, and they're both the same. It's just clarified here in this translation. Yeah. The people passed through.
Yeah.
And this is a chapter on faith. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of the people who are in danger of separating and leaving the people. Being part of the people is an act of faith, and leaving them is a disloyalty action. The people passed through the Red Sea. Now, you didn't have to go through. It was a communal experience. But to leave the community, to hold back and not belong to it,
Yeah.
later it will say, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together. Here is the communal experience. Individuals, Abraham, Moses, Joseph, and so on, and more to follow. But this has an inclusion, I think, that's very important. And the same with the walls of Jericho. Just marching around, you are doing what you ought to be doing, but you're part of the community, and it strengthens. And they apparently are thinking of leaving that community, which will weaken them and the community.
Oh, yes, that's the telling point, isn't it?
Yes.
It's misfortune on both sides. There's a loss. And so here, these two verses, 29 and 30, excuse me, we don't have any names. There are no names.
Yes.
We get to Rahab in 31, but she joined. She was not departing.
Yeah.
So the sense of communal solidarity, I think is the word we're looking for, pervades this. Now we're going to get other names coming up right along in the following verses, but he pauses right here to kind of congeal the group as a group and get that in mind for us, doesn't it? Leo, anything else that you would like to observe on this before we
Just
go
to
on?
further add what Dr. Taylor has said,
Yeah.
indeed, faithfulness is highlighted here in a communal sense. And what also comes through here is the different social historical settings in which persevering faith gets expressed in. And also the miraculous dimension of these two stories, both the crossing of the Red Sea, they had to step out in faith, trusting that those walls would not come down. And then also being faithful and obedient that the walls of Jericho would indeed come down after these 7 days of walking around them. So persevering faith expressed in different contexts and a miraculous dimension to them. Sometimes the outcome is immediate and you see it. Other times the outcome of persevering faith does not take place in the present. As the author said here previously, all these were faithful and yet they did not obtain the promises. The outcomes reside in the future.
Yeah. In the Gospels, we have Jesus kind of shaking his fist at the religio-political authorities of the day and saying the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom ahead of you. Well, here's an example, maybe.
Verse 31.
Yeah.
By faith, Rahab the prostitute, the harlot.
Yeah.
Here is a woman who was typically judged by her profession and found wanting at every level. And the apostle sees somebody because she had received the spies in peace. Don't be quick to judge, and this may be a message for the faithful under the sphere of the apostle who were quick to judge. Here is a woman. Here is somebody to be considered for who she is. Now, women could wish that some other example had been chosen, but, and this is one of those situations, the Latin is mutatis mutandis, all necessary changes having been made. In the interpretation of the story, it's here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, one of the women in Matthew 1.
Yeah, I just looked it up. She's there.
Still there?
Just still there. Only a few women are mentioned, but Rahab is one of them.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful story. It really is. Sort of from the lowest to the highest ancestry of Jesus, human side.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so these heroes and sheroes, Beth, are superhuman on one level and very human on another, it seems, at the same time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, part of what Dr. Taylor was saying too is, being part of a community. And I think one of the things that we can find being stressed, I think, through Rahab is she belonged to a community of self. And so then opening herself up to belong to this wider community that she doesn't technically know. Here's this moment of faith that we had talked about. You are walking into the complete unknown and hoping that what they stand for and what they're calling their own faith as they ask you to join them is going to be something that will in fact save your life. Here's a moment of having to identify, do you leave this group? Because joining this group, essentially she would be forfeiting her life in a different way, right? Belonging to a different group that she had maybe grown accustomed to. When we think back at the story, she's pretty solid in saying, here are my standards, right? Here's what I belong to, what I know. So forfeiting that, and then, because she's able to move into that, her name comes up later. I mean, right? She was no one before, and all of a sudden we identify her as one of the few women who get mentioned.
That's right.
And it is a break from a different community and then joining a different community. But sometimes the community of self is so grounding that we forget about what it means to actually join a larger community for a different purpose. So I found that particularly interesting because you do have this massive community that they talk about Jericho and the people, right, as they cross the sea. And that is a really visible, large group. And then we have this community of one, which I think is really quite fascinating, especially now as we're moving into, post the Gospels too, as Jesus is a community of one, and yet Jesus always finds different ways to embed himself into a larger community, beginning with, the group of his disciples. I mean, how incredible is that? So I thought about that as she is one of the first ones that's named individually after these separate groups.
Yeah.
I think that's significant as we kind of think of our modern day. We function very individualistically. So how are we as a community of selves joining a community of other, and how the community of other really is a different projection of the church, right? A different projection of our communities of faith.
Yeah, that's right. And you
There are two
captured that
interesting elements to the backstory of this Rahab
well.
reference. The first is the obvious when you think about it, fact that those men who were saved appreciated it, mentioned it, and then the community sent her a text or whatever means of communication, and said, put out a scarlet cord and your life will be saved. And that simple act was her response to a situation that offered her a different life, and she took it.
You got to salute that, don't you? something there.
Having said all these things about Rahab, I'd like to do a critique here of this author, because there's lots of men listed in here, and yet only 2 women. Right?
Yeah.
And so we do see the social historical aspect of this text coming through, where mostly men are highlighted for persevering faith, and he only has Sarah and Rahab mentioned, and Rahab is a prostitute. Surely there were other faithful women in that ancient world that he overlooked and forgot to bring to light.
Well, you have
And I think we
people like-
today would note that.
Yeah.
But even having said that, the point is worth taking.
Yeah,
that
it
Rahab
needs to
does.
be remarked upon.
There were plenty he could have picked.
Exactly.
Deborah,
Right.
was a heroic figure.
Yeah.
People like that. Ruth,
Yes.
Sure.
whole book written about Ruth.
Right.
Yeah,
Esther.
After.
yeah. John, a little thought just in passing.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Moses, whom we looked at last time, and now Rahab. They both left the people that they grew up with to cast in their lot with God's people. Now, Moses was born into an Israelite home, but he was taken, very young. He grew up in the king's court. But what does he do? He casts in his lot, the people of God. Rahab is not an Israelite, okay, but she casts in her lot, okay, with the people of God. Interesting parallel between the two.
It is. There are boundary crossings at work here, aren't there?
Oh, yeah.
And again, when we think of the people to whom this is written, the Hebrews, but the Christians called Gentiles who converted Hebrews, in a sense, too, didn't they? So I think that these figures serve important functions in the community as people who had the courage to step out and re-identify themselves.
That's right.
In a new direction. And I think that's what's really the dynamic of this. That was true 2,000 years ago and is true for us today.
In the Old Testament, you see two strands running. One is an exclusive strand.
Yep. Yep.
At times very strictly enforced, like in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. But there's another strand that is inclusive of non-Israelites. It's interesting how these run side by side. But as you move toward the end of the Old Testament and the Messianic age, the inclusive dimension becomes dominant.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. And Jesus then identifies himself with that current or that strain of the Hebraic background.
John?
So. Yeah, please.
As I've said before, I really like to, as I've noted, reconstruct the social setting and see how this homiletician, this preacher, speaks to it. And Dr. Johnson's alluded to this. And I imagine these folks who've lost their property, perhaps sitting in prison.
Oh, yeah, chapter 12.
I was in a 3 or 4 bedroom home with the comforts of home, and I enjoyed a relatively good life. And now my commitment to Christ is costing me significantly. And so this example of Moses, I think, fits so perfectly such a person. Look at this person who had the Egyptian royal court and all of its treasures available to him, but no, he chooses to forsake it all, these earthly pleasures for the cause of God. So I think that is a wonderful way for a preacher to encourage his people to be steadfast and faithful, just like Moses.
Yeah, we can hardly imagine what some of these people went through.
But of course, the ultimate example is coming. Of Jesus. Right at the beginning of chapter 12.
Yes, but it's of a piece with a history, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, there's a background here. So Beverly, do you want to pick up in verse 32 and the pace quickens now, doesn't it? It's like a drum beat, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Take us down through, I don't know, verse 38 is the paragraph in the New Revised Standard.
All right. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still, others had trial of mockings and scornings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain by the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth.
Wow, a real estrangement from the world here, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, these are people who hardly belong to anything, it seems, doesn't it? What else strikes you, Bev, as you read this?
Well, it's definitely a little bit of a contrast. It's fascinating as we, the first couple of names in children's ministry, we teach them as heroes. We talk about them as, you want to be brave like David, look at all of these. these characteristics of them, and then as it moves through the end of these last couple of verses, it turns a little bit rated R. Some of these descriptions are quite fascinating to see how maybe these hero-some people actually had more of a different life than we can imagine. We don't always tell the full story. We don't always observe all of the details of what's happening before we reach a heroic moment, and how even after that heroic moment, there's a lot afterwards that happens. So that's kind of an interesting for me, is looking at all of these details of the shift in life. Talk about resigning to riches and going, if would you do that if you knew this list, right? It's kind of like reading the medication list. These are all the side effects if you take this pill. This feels very much like that. Are you going to swallow that? Are you going to absorb this in your own? And I wonder if all of these people knew these were going to be what was going to happen according to you following this life of faith. Would they have subscribed to it? But they didn't, and yet they did. Here's the life that they chose. So, I don't know.
Yeah, you've that's right. I think that's the central message here in this paragraph, isn't it? Bernard, anything in particular here?
Yes. Along the lines that we have been discussing, what I see here is a conscious universalizing. No, that's too big. But an opening up. To other professions, other circumstances, with the key element of faithfulness. Whatever you're doing, do it faithfully. And at first it seems as though he should have followed his first instinct and stopped the list. But if he had, it would have excluded so many of us. But now, even at war, and a sad and sorry list. But it happened, and people were faithful in the face of all of these circumstances and continued through. And again, we have another category. It was the women who experienced resurrection. And so at all levels, and I think when you add this into the rest of the chapter that went ahead of it, we do see confirmed that whatever your lot, faithfulness is what is expected of you, and faithfulness means to continue and not to give up whatever may come your way.
Bernard, these names are Old Testament names, as we would refer to the Hebrew Scriptures, and yet, and some of the references even unnamed, like to Jeremiah and Isaiah. We think Jeremiah was stoned, Isaiah being stoned.
Daniel. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think lurking in the background is the more recent memory of the Maccabean period.
Yes.
Which was a time when the Jewish people really were under the iron fist of Greek rulers who were very unsympathetic to their religion.
He begins with the book of Judges, which is, we look at that easily as the time when God was absent or rarely present, and it was the Dark Ages. After the time of Joshua, here are the Dark Ages, and he turns there with these judges. They weren't judges like we think of judges. Why do we call them judges? Because in the Hebrew and the Greek, the word is judge. But these were like charismatic leaders. And they face difficult circumstances, and it's acknowledged here. And then all of those other categories, and you do it well to bring it down to what, around 150?
A couple of centuries before Jesus.
Yes, a couple of centuries before. And there is so much that is covered here, nameless, but appreciated, because they all were faithful.
So in a way, the lesson is, listen, people, this is your spiritual DNA, right? You've got this in your veins. And so live up remember who you are. Anything else, Leo?
So, and you've nicely set up what I'd like to say, and that is, again, a wonderful homiletical response to the social setting of those house churches. But what about those of us that live in the West?
Yeah.
3-bedroom homes, a relatively comfortable Christian walk. We work and we worship on Sabbath. In what way is this material, which is so pronounced in terms of hardship and suffering and persevere in the midst of all that, in what way is this relevant to us today? You know, how does a pastor look at this material and think of our situation and its applicability to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. 'Cause I've been thinking about that. A big part of it, I think, is remembering this is your history, right? Don't get too far ahead of yourself in thinking that you're. You know, earlier we had talked a little bit about a community of self, right? Like that you're an exempt community, you're far from this. But in fact, this is woven into who you are.
Right.
And if at one point are we denying that in a way, kind of, you know, so.
But isn't there part of you that I'm grateful that I'm not having to go through anything like this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's looking backwards and going, well, absolutely.
And yet, wow, how impressive it is.
Right. Or maybe it's a call to pay attention because maybe this doesn't look this way now, right? We're not in mountains and caves, and yet there is a wilderness in the West. There is lots to pay attention to. There's lots that calls for a faithfulness, right? Yeah.
There are places in this world
That's right.
where much more recently people have suffered terribly for their Christian faith. Yeah, scattered around the world, but very, very severe sufferings and hardships, sometimes linked with one or another identity or ethnicity or tribal group or something, but sometimes on the grounds of nothing more than simply Christian belief. I will not dwell on this in great detail, except simply to say that my own ordination to the ministry was at the hands of about a dozen pastors on the other side of the world who had suffered terribly for their faith. They had lost members of their family. Many cases like that. And ordination, or even simply to share a community, a faith community, with people who are made out of that, sticks with you. You know, it's one of those identity markers. Rituals are powerful.
Yeah.
And when they are founded upon a history like this, they do work change in our lives. We grow through that kind of exposure and incorporation into the community. And so we will continue asking ourselves as we march onward here through this procession of outstanding yet all too human figures, we will think further about what it is to be a marginalized people who share that vision and who share the hardships. We'll do more of that next time, Searching for Answers.